You know that feeling when you check your bank account and there's like $847 in there and you immediately start doing math in your head? Rent's coming up, car insurance is due, you need groceries, and oh yeah, your friend's wedding is next month and you still haven't bought a gift. And suddenly that $847 feels like $12. It feels like nothing. It feels like you're one unexpected expense away from everything falling apart. And here's the thing, you're not being dramatic. That anxiety isn't irrational. When you have less than a certain amount of money, life genuinely operates on a different level of difficulty. Everything costs more. Everything takes more energy. Every single decision carries this weight that people with more money just don't experience. My name is Emmy, and I spend way too much time thinking about money, financial psychology, and why some people seem to effortlessly glide through the exact same financial challenges that keep other people stuck in this constant state of low-level panic for years. And one of the most fascinating patterns I've noticed, both in research and in real life, is that there's this specific threshold where everything shifts, where life stops feeling like you're constantly playing defense and starts feeling like you can actually breathe. That number for most people is somewhere around $20,000. Now, I'm not talking about $20,000 in income or $20,000 worth of stuff. I'm talking about $20,000 in actual liquid savings, money sitting in your bank account, money that's just there. And I know what you might be thinking, $20,000? That's cute, but I'm trying to figure out how to save $2,000. And I get it, I really do. But here's what nobody really explains. Why $20,000 specifically seems to be this weird inflection point where the entire game changes. Because it's not just about having more money, it's about how money, or the lack of it, fundamentally reshapes every single aspect of how you live. And understanding why this threshold exists might actually change how you think about your own financial journey. Let's start with something most people don't consciously realize. Being broke is incredibly expensive. I know that sounds contradictory, but stay with me. When you don't have money, you end up paying more for basically everything. It's like there's this poverty tax that gets applied to your entire life, and most people don't even see it happening. Here's a perfect example. Let's say your car breaks down. You need new brakes. If you have $20,000 in savings, you pay the $400 for the brake job. It sucks. You move on. But if you have $200 in your account and rent is due next week, now you're looking at options. Maybe you put it on a credit card at 24% interest. Maybe you go to one of those buy now, pay later places. Maybe you just wait and hope the brakes hold out a little longer, which of course makes the problem worse and more expensive when you finally have to deal with it. Or here's another one, banking fees. If you have $20,000 in your account, you're probably getting free checking, maybe even earning a bit of interest. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck, overdraft fees, minimum balance fees, ATM fees because you needed cash and couldn't wait to find your bank's ATM, monthly service charges. It adds up to hundreds of dollars a year just for the privilege of being poor. Insurance works the same way. When you can afford to pay your car insurance annually or every 6 months, you get a discount. But if you're broke, you're paying monthly, which means you're paying maybe 15 to 20% more over the course of a year for the exact same coverage. Same with rent. If you could pay a few months up front, you might get a discount or avoid application fees. But when you're broke, you pay more because you have less. It's honestly kind of insane when you think about it. And it's not just about fees and interest rates. It's about the stuff you can't buy in bulk. People with money can go to Costco and buy 48 rolls of toilet paper for 50 cents per roll. But if you're broke, you're buying the 4-pack at the corner store for $1.25 per roll because that's all you can afford right now. You know buying in bulk saves money, but you can't access those savings because you don't have the upfront capital. This is what I mean when I say being broke is expensive. You're constantly paying a premium for not having money, and that premium makes it even harder to save money, which keeps you trapped in this cycle. But here's where it gets really interesting, and honestly, kind of psychological. When you don't have money, you can't think clearly. And I don't mean that in some judgmental way like poor people make bad decisions. I mean it literally. Financial stress occupies cognitive bandwidth. There's actually research on this. Researchers found that the mental burden of financial scarcity is equivalent to losing about 13 IQ points. 13. That's the difference between average intelligence and borderline impaired functioning. Think about what that means in real terms. When you're constantly worried about money, when you're always doing that math in your head about what you can and can't afford, when you're juggling which bill to pay first, that mental energy has to come from somewhere. And it comes from the part of your brain that's supposed to be making good long-term decisions, solving problems, being creative, planning for the future. You're literally too stressed to think straight. I remember talking to someone once who described it perfectly. She said it felt like she was trying to run a marathon while doing calculus in her head. Like, technically she could do both, but she wasn't going to be good at either one. And that's what financial stress does. It takes up so much mental space that everything else in your life gets harder. You're more irritable with your family because you're stressed about money. You perform worse at work because part of your brain is always calculating expenses. You make worse food choices because you're exhausted from financial anxiety and you just need something easy and comforting. You don't have the energy to research better phone plans or negotiate your medical bills or comparison shop for insurance because you're already operating at maximum capacity just trying to survive. And here's the cruel part. All of those stress-induced decisions often make your financial situation worse, which creates more stress, which impairs your thinking even more. It's a vicious cycle. So what happens when you hit $20,000? Why is that the magic number? Well, first of all, it's not magic, and it's not the same for everyone. For some people, it might be $15,000. For others, it might be $25,000 or $30,000. But there's something about that range, roughly $20,000, that represents a specific type of security. With $20,000 in the bank, you have roughly 3 to 6 months of expenses covered for most people. And that's huge. That's the difference between an emergency being a crisis and an emergency being an inconvenience. Car breaks down? Annoying, but not devastating. Lose your job? Scary, but you have time to find something decent instead of taking the first thing that comes along. Medical bill? You can actually negotiate it instead of just panicking. Suddenly, you have options, and options are what change everything. But it's not just about emergencies. Having $20,000 means you can start making decisions based on what's good for your future instead of what you can afford right now. You can buy the $200 pair of work boots that'll last 5 years instead of the $50 pair that'll last 6 months. You can move to a cheaper apartment because you can afford the security deposit and moving costs. You can invest in that certification or course that might lead to a better job. You can negotiate a medical bill by offering to pay a lump sum up front. You can switch to a cheaper insurance plan with a higher deductible because you actually have the deductible covered if something happens. Basically, you can start accessing all those discounts and efficiencies and better deals that were always there but were previously out of reach. The poverty tax starts to disappear. And then there's the psychological shift, which honestly might be even more important than the practical stuff. When you have $20,000 in the bank, you stop living in survival mode. And I don't think people who've never experienced chronic financial stress really understand what survival mode does to you. In survival mode, you can't think past next week. You can't make long-term plans because long-term doesn't exist when you're not sure if you can pay rent next month. You can't invest in yourself, in your education, your health, your career, because all your resources are going toward just making it through today. But with $20,000, suddenly your brain has permission to think about the future. You can start asking different questions. Not, can I afford this right now? But, is this a good decision for where I want to be in 5 years? Not, how do I survive this month? But, how do I build something sustainable? It's like the difference between playing chess and playing whack-a-mole. When you're broke, you're just reacting, hitting whatever problem pops up. But with some financial cushion, you can actually strategize. You can make moves that won't pay off for 6 months or a year because you're not desperately trying to solve an immediate crisis. And here's something interesting. People who reach this threshold often talk about feeling calmer, less anxious, like they can finally breathe. And that's not just psychological, that's real. When you're not constantly stressed about money, your cortisol levels drop. You sleep better. Your relationships improve because you're not constantly irritable and scared. You perform better at work because you're not mentally exhausted from financial stress. Section 5. Building momentum, more passionate. Here's another thing that changes after $20,000. Your relationship with risk. When you're broke, you can't take chances. You can't quit a job you hate because you need the paycheck. You can't start a side business because you can't risk the startup costs. You can't move for a better opportunity because you can't afford the transition period. You can't invest in the stock market because you literally can't afford for that money to fluctuate. You're trapped in whatever situation you're currently in, even if that situation is slowly grinding you down because you can't afford the risk of change. But $20,000? That's screw you money. Not screw you, I'm rich money, but screw you, I have options money. It's enough to quit a toxic job and take a month to find something better. It's enough to negotiate salary from a position of strength instead of desperation. It's enough to start a side project without betting your entire livelihood on it. It's enough to say no. And being able to say no is incredibly powerful. No, I won't stay in this abusive work environment. No, I won't take that lowball offer. No, I won't tolerate disrespect because I'm too scared to lose my income. No, I won't stay in this situation that's destroying my mental health. People underestimate how much of wealth building is just about having enough security to make better choices. You can't make strategic decisions when you're terrified. You can't negotiate when you're desperate. You can't invest in your future when you're drowning in your present. Now, let's talk about something that nobody really mentions. $20,000 is also the point where money starts working for you instead of you just working for money. Before this point, every dollar you make is immediately spoken for. Rent, food, utilities, debt payments, basic survival. You're working to generate money that immediately disappears into obligations. It's exhausting because there's no accumulation, no progress. You're running as fast as you can just to stay in the same place. But after $20,000, something shifts. You still have expenses, obviously, but now you have enough cushion that you can start being strategic. You can wait for sales. You can make choices that cost a bit more upfront but save money long term. You can start investing, even small amounts, and let compound interest do some of the work for you. You can negotiate better deals because you can walk away. You have leverage. And leverage is everything in financial decisions. Like, let's say you're buying a car. If you're broke and you need a car to get to work, you're taking whatever deal the dealership offers because you're desperate. But if you have $20,000 in the bank, you can negotiate. You can wait for a better offer. You can pay cash for a used car and avoid the loan entirely. You can walk away from a bad deal because you have other options. Or let's say you're looking at apartments. Broke? You're taking what you can get, probably paying more than you should because landlords know desperate people don't have choices. But with savings, you can negotiate move-in costs. You can wait for a better place. You can afford to live somewhere cheaper that requires a bigger security deposit. This is what I mean by money working for you. It's not passive income or investments yet, though that comes next. It's just having enough that the money itself becomes a tool that helps you make better decisions, which creates more money, which gives you more options. It's a virtuous cycle instead of a vicious one. Let's get specific about what $20,000 actually enables, because I think this is where it gets really practical. First, it covers most true emergencies. Medical crisis, car accident, sudden job loss, emergency dental work, major home repair. Most of these fall in the $5,000 to $15,000 range. With $20,000, you're covered, and you still have cushion left over. You're not wiped out by one crisis. Second, it lets you avoid debt for irregular expenses. You know how there are those expenses that aren't emergencies but aren't regular either? Car registration, holiday gifts, annual insurance premiums, that thing where all your appliances decide to break at once. These are budget killers when you're living paycheck to paycheck because they're not in your monthly calculations. But with $20,000, you can handle them without putting them on a credit card. Third, it gives you transition security. Want to change careers? Move to a new city? Go back to school? Leave a bad situation? All of these require a transition period where your income might be unstable or non-existent. $20,000 gives you that runway. It's not enough to never work again, but it's enough to make a change without catastrophe. Fourth, and this is big, it lets you start optimizing for the long term instead of just surviving the short term. You can get the preventive dental work that'll save you thousands later. You can buy quality items that last instead of cheap stuff that breaks. You can invest in your career development. You can start putting money in retirement accounts. You can make choices that won't pay off for years because you're not in crisis mode anymore. Okay, so here's what I know you're thinking. This all sounds great, but how the hell do I get to $20,000 when I'm barely making it to the end of the month? And that's a fair question. Because here's the truth, getting to $20,000 is brutally hard when you're starting from zero or negative. It requires sacrifice. It requires consistency. It requires probably years of doing things that aren't fun. But here's what I want you to understand. The first $20,000 is the hardest money you'll ever save. Everything after that gets easier. Not easy, but easier. Because once you have that foundation, you're no longer paying the poverty tax. You're no longer making desperate decisions that cost you more in the long run. You're no longer drowning in stress that impairs your judgment. Every dollar you save after $20,000 has less friction because you've eliminated so many of the things that make being broke expensive. So how do you get there? Honestly, there's no magic trick. You need to increase income, decrease expenses, or both. You need to be relentless about it. You need to track every dollar. You need to say no to things you want. You need to make sacrifices that your friends might not understand. But here's the thing. You don't need to save $20,000 this year. You probably can't. But you could save $2,000 this year, or even $1,000. And next year, when you're not paying as many fees and you've cut some expenses and maybe increased your income a bit, maybe you save $3,000. And the year after that, $4,000. It compounds. Not just the money, but the habits, the mindset, the momentum. And every $1,000 you save makes the next 1,000 easier because you're slowly escaping the expensive trap of being broke. Here's what I think is the most important thing to understand about the $20,000 threshold. It's not about the money itself. I mean, yes, obviously it's about the money, but what it really represents is freedom. Not quit your job and travel the world freedom, but make choices based on what's right for you instead of what you're forced into freedom. It's the freedom to leave a bad situation, the freedom to take a chance on something better, the freedom to invest in your future, the freedom to make decisions without panic, the freedom to think clearly because your brain isn't constantly hijacked by financial stress. It's the freedom to be treated with dignity instead of desperation. And that changes everything about how you move through the world. Your posture changes. The way you negotiate changes. The opportunities you can even see change because you're not just in survival mode. I've watched people hit this threshold and it's like something unlocks. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually they start making different choices, better choices. They start thinking bigger. They start believing that progress is possible because they've actually experienced progress. And that belief that things can get better, that you're not permanently stuck, might be the most valuable thing $20,000 buys you. Look, I'm not going to lie to you and say that $20,000 solves all your problems. It doesn't make you rich. It doesn't mean you never worry about money again. There are people with $20,000 saved who still feel broke because they live in expensive cities or have significant debt or have expensive medical conditions. But for most people, in most situations, $20,000 represents a fundamental shift in how life feels. It's the difference between drowning and treading water. It's the difference between playing defense every single day and actually being able to make some offensive moves. It's the point where life stops feeling quite so hard all the time. And if you're not there yet, if you're reading this with $300 in your account or $3,000, or even if you're negative, I want you to know that this threshold is reachable. Not quickly, not easily, but reachable. Every person I know who's built real financial security started exactly where you are. Stressed, tired, wondering if they'd ever get ahead. And they got there by being stubborn about it, by saving when it didn't make sense to save, by tracking every dollar, by saying no over and over again, by increasing their income however they could, by playing the long game even when the short game was miserable. The first $20,000 is the hardest, but it's also the most important because it's not just money you're building, it's the foundation for everything that comes after. And once you're there, once you hit that threshold where you can finally breathe, you'll look back and realize that the struggle to get there taught you everything you needed to know about building real, lasting wealth. So start where you are. Save what you can. Be patient with yourself, but relentless with your habits. And remember, the goal isn't just to have $20,000 in the bank. The goal is to build a life where money stops being the thing that controls every decision you make. That's what changes after $20,000. That's why life gets easier. And that freedom, that's worth every sacrifice it takes to get there.